Hi, my name is Sarah Nooter. I'm a professor of classics at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Odyssey, about the character Circe, who is in the Odyssey, and about a novel called Circe by Madeline Miller. So the Odyssey is one of the very earliest pieces of literature from Greek literature. In the 8th century BCE, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey produced by Homer. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. We know there is an oral tradition of chanting poetic lines, and that we know that at some point, somebody sits down and writes down an epic called the Iliad, and about 20, 30, 40 years later, another one called the Odyssey. The Iliad is a story of the Trojan War. It really tells us the last couple of weeks in the 9th year of the Trojan War. And so we're not quite at the end, but we're close to the downfall of many of the characters we love and of Troy. The Odyssey follows the Iliad in the chronology of the story and tells us of the return of the warrior Odysseus to his homeland Ithaca. So the Odyssey is called a nostos story. Nostos means return. So it takes place, of course, after the Iliad, and it also is in some ways a different kind of story than the Iliad, and it's told in a different way. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both incredibly important stories in Greek literature and Greek culture, and were taken by archaic and classical Greeks to be history in a way, more than literature, and inform everything that happens in terms of literature and culture after that. So the Odyssey is a very self-aware kind of epic. Like the Iliad, it has 24 books, but the Iliad starts at the beginning of a few weeks span and it moves to the end of it directly, whereas the Odyssey takes us on a lot of twists and turns. One of the interesting things about how the Odyssey is told is that there's a chunk of story in the middle of it which is actually narrated by the character Odysseus himself. So, as you may know, Odysseus has spent 10 years in Troy fighting, and when Troy falls, he spends 10 years trying to get home. So he's away for 20 years total. The first half of the Odyssey tells the story of him trying to get home, and the second half of the Odyssey tells the story of him getting home and fighting the suitors that he finds there who are trying to take over his household and his wife. In the middle of that, we have a stretch that is often called the Apologia. It's books or chapters 9 through 11. And this is the part that Odysseus narrates that I mentioned. He tells his story of wandering to an audience of people called the Phaeacians. And the story he tells is a complicated tale that takes place from when he leaves Troy to when he arrives at the Phaeacians. More or less. And what's interesting about that is that if you happen to know stories from the Odyssey, a lot of what you know comes out of that chunk of text. So Odysseus tells how he met the Cyclops, he talks about Circe, he talks about Calypso, he talks about the Laestrygonians, and in fact, many of what we think of as the fantastical elements of the story happen here. So just to back up for a moment, if you read the Iliad, you will find a lot of warriors and you will find gods. And the gods come down from Olympus and they meet the warriors and they talk to them. And in the Odyssey, you have something different than that. Besides the gods and the people, you have this whole kind of middle section of life, which you might think of as hailing from a tradition that involves folklore. You have monsters, you have magic, you have witches, you have this whole mysterious kind of opening of beings that doesn't exist in other kinds of Greek literature. And if you try, as some people do, to map out the journey of Odysseus, you'll find that you go off the map when you hit this fantastical part of the story. And then you re-enter the map when Odysseus returns to Ithaca. And so within this kind of fantastical world that Odysseus tells people about, because we actually never hear about it when Odysseus is not the one narrating it, one of the people, or I should say gods, that he meets is Circe. Circe is a witch, as you'll find out in the novel, and she's also a goddess, and she lives by herself on an island. She's an interesting example of the kind of characters that Odysseus meets. Many of them are not followers of the usual Greek system of household living, right? So in Greek culture, you tend to live with your family, you live in a society, your community is very important, and you have a kind of concentric rings of communal relations and relations with other aristocrats, say, or friends or allies. But the various beings that Odysseus meets on the way home tend to be more isolated. And so Circe is an example of this. She is self-sufficient. She's a goddess, but she's not like the other gods, right? She doesn't live up in Olympus. She lives with animals, wild animals whom she's tamed. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have a story in any significant way. Sometimes readers mix her up with Calypso, who is a nymph, who Odysseus also meets along the way. So as you may remember, Odysseus comes to Circe's island after he's lost many of his men to an encounter with the Cyclops. By that point, many of his ships are gone, and he and his one ship of men who remain are very disheartened. Odysseus sends some of his men to go check out the island. They stumble upon Circe. She feeds them and then turns them into pigs. And one guy escapes and comes back and tells Odysseus this. And Odysseus goes to save them, but on his way, fortunately, meets Hermes, who gives him a special herb which protects him. And so when Odysseus meets Circe, he follows Hermes' directions about how to resist her powers, and also follows Hermes' advice, which is to bed Circe and to speak to her in other ways that will keep him safe. So Odysseus follows all of this advice and ends up staying with Circe for a whole year, and only leaves when his men come and tell him, don't we still want to go home? So at that point, he goes to Circe and says, look, I'd like to leave. And she says, that's absolutely fine. I don't want to keep you here against your will. And she gives him important advice. She sends him to the underworld where he gets prophecies and such and meets other characters. And then he returns, and Circe gives him the kind of advice he'll need to get through the rest of the challenges that he'll face before he gets home. So that's Circe. I'll just say briefly that it's only at the end of this journey that he meets Calypso. Calypso is another nymph who keeps Odysseus on her island, and this time for 6 or 7 years. By now, Odysseus is all alone. He's lost all of his men. And Calypso wants to marry Odysseus. She doesn't want to let him leave and go back to his home and to his wife, Penelope. And so that's a really important difference, I think, and that's why I bring this up. Calypso is alone and she's sad and she wants a man. Circe is alone and she's not sad and she enjoys having Odysseus around, but she is not desperate for him to stay. She is a threat in that she turns his men into pigs initially, and she clearly could do harm, but she also switches over pretty quickly to being a friend and an ally. And so in these particular ways of mixing threat and friend, sort of lone woman, but not lonely woman, she's a very unique character in Greek literature because she's really, in a certain sense, powerful and anomalous. And that gives her, in the Greek tradition, a kind of opacity. We don't really understand what makes her tick. And we don't see her from the inside, right? We see her in terms of how she helps or hurts Odysseus. In this way, there's room for Madeline Miller to enter the character and to do something there because she has a kind of opaque screen around her. So what Miller does, which is really fascinating, is that she gives Circe an internality. She gives her a character, desires, wants, needs, insecurities. And she does that especially by giving her a story, a life story. So even though Circe is known in literary tradition through her encounter with Odysseus, we don't actually meet Odysseus in this novel until pretty far in. We spend a long time on the life story of Circe and coming to understand what makes her who she is. And Miller is very clever, I think, in how she weaves in bits of Greek mythology from other sources. So if you read along here, you'll find many different stories that really do come from the tradition, but that do not come from the Odyssey. So you meet Jason and Medea, you meet Prometheus, and so on. And there's a source for just about every story that Miller draws from, but she draws them together in a unique way that creates a character that is really all her own character. So I don't want to give anything away, so I don't want to say much more about what happens. I hope I'll be talking to you after you have a chance to read the novel. I'll just say before I sign off a few things that I think are interesting about how Miller proceeds, and a few themes I think I would suggest you pay attention to. So a pretty big one is something like gender encased. I think it's pretty clear that Circe's gender is highlighted, right? She's somebody who is often being treated poorly because of because she's female, and she finds different ways of handling that. And I think that's something Miller is very interested in. So I'll just leave that one aside. That's a big one. Another issue that Miller makes a big deal of is something like caste or status. She is very aware of, and I would say more than aware of, she's a creator of a story that has different strata of beings. So we have divinities, but we have high divinities, middling divinities, low ones. We have gender working within that system. We have Titans versus the new Olympian gods. So that does come right out of Greek mythology. There's behind the kind of present system of gods where Zeus is in charge, you had before that the Titans, when his father Kronos was in charge. And Kronos was a Titan who had other Titan buddies and family members like Prometheus. And they do battle with Zeus, or a number of battles with Zeus, and they lose, but stick around in some fashion or other. So that backstory very much informs the kind of tale that Miller is telling here. And also the way the gods oppress each other, right? So powerful as they seem to humans who are kind of at the bottom of the pile, they have divisions of power within themselves. And we end up with a very complicated, sometimes very nasty world that Circe inhabits. Within that world, we see Circe, the character, attain a kind of voice. And when I say voice, I mean both a literal voice, like the voice with which she speaks that comes out of her body, and also the more metaphorical sense of voice that people often mean. Miller is picking up on something really specific in the Odyssey, which is that when we first meet Circe, she's said to be a character who has a human way of speaking. She's speaking human-like. Nobody really knows what that means, but you can see that Miller takes that and runs with it and does something very interesting with that. So I'll just leave that for you to discover, and maybe we can talk about it. The way her voice, her literal voice that comes out of her mouth functions also relates to how she finds voice as a kind of character, how she finds ability, and how she makes her way through the world. So we can talk about that as well. One of the interesting things that Miller also handles is a question about immortality. At first, we think we're in a kind of normal story. We hear about a little child goddess or nymph. We see her grow up. But after a point, we come to realize that time is not functioning the way it functions for you and me. Circe is immortal, and the story continues, and hundreds of years are going by. And we start to wonder, I think, what the end game is here, or as we would say in Greek literature, the telos. What is the end of an immortal life? Or what is the point of an immortal life, right? How do we get a story from a life that goes on forever? So this is a question not just for Madeline Miller, but it becomes a question for the character Circe herself, right? How is she going to have a life story that makes sense? So that, I think, is a really fascinating question. And again, until you get to the end, I don't think we can really have a good conversation about that. So let's keep that in mind. And finally, especially for fans of Greek mythology, it's really fun to meet these characters as you make your way through the novel. I think inevitably the most important and controversial rendering that we're going to get here is that of Odysseus. We're going to see a couple Odysseus's, right? The Odysseus that Circe meets, and then we get the Odysseus after that, right? So we're going to see the scenes more or less that happen in the Odyssey told from a different perspective. But then we see a kind of what happens when life goes on. And I think that some of the choices that Miller makes here are very brave and very interesting. So I would suggest that you pay attention to them, and I hope we can talk about them when we are all done with the novel. So thanks very much and enjoy reading.